A wounded jaguar asks a hunter for help. What the hunter did left everyone speechless. Before the story begins, if you like our channel, subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. And now we invite you to enjoy a story with an unexpected ending. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long, mysterious shadows through the dense trees of the Amazon rainforest. Jack, an experienced hunter, moved silently across the dry leaves on the forest floor, his sharp eyes scanning for any movement that might reveal the presence of an animal. He carried a well-polished rifle and a light backpack with basic supplies, intending to return to camp before nightfall. Jack's life had always been marked by the adrenaline of the hunt. From a young age, he had learned to blend with nature, observe its rhythms, and exercise patience. But that afternoon, something felt different. The usual sounds of birds and small creatures in the trees had faded, leaving the forest shrouded in an eerie, almost unsettling silence. As he pressed on, a faint, irregular sound caught his attention. He froze, holding his breath, trying to decipher its origin. At first, it seemed like the cry of an animal, but it was low and almost human, filled with suffering. Intrigued, Jack followed the sound, carefully weaving his way through branches and undergrowth. As he got closer, he noticed a bush moving slightly, as if something was hidden inside. He tightened his grip on his rifle, ready for anything. It could be a wounded predator, or a trap, he thought. Carefully, he pushed aside the branches and came face to face with a sight that would change his life forever. Lying in a small, leaf-covered clearing was a jaguar. It was an adult female, but something was clearly wrong. She was lying on her side, breathing heavily, with a visible wound on her rear right paw. As Jack's footsteps approached, she lifted her head with effort, her golden eyes locking onto his. It was a unique, tense moment. The jaguar didn't growl or show any signs of aggression. Instead, she looked at him with an expression that seemed to plead for something. Jack stood frozen. He had encountered wild animals before, but this was different. That gaze felt almost human, filled with pain and astonishingly trust. What would the hunter do? The air was thick with tension, and Jack knew that any move he made could be fatal. If he helped, he'd be putting his life at risk. If he left the animal there, it might be too late. The forest seemed to hold its breath as he decided what to do next. Jack stood still, analyzing the scene before him. The jaguar, known as one of the most powerful and dangerous creatures in the forest, lay vulnerable like never before. Its eyes gleamed with pain and something that seemed to be a silent plea for help. He felt the weight of his rifle in his hands. Part of him was ready to defend himself if necessary, but the other part kept him from pulling the trigger. There was something about this moment unlike any he had experienced before. With a heavy sigh, Jack slowly lowered his weapon, signaling that he wasn't a threat. He took a cautious step forward, his heart pounding in his chest, and knelt at a safe distance, trying to better assess the situation. The jaguar let out a low growl, not a warning of attack, but a reflex of pain. Jack could now see the severity of the wound, a deep gash on its rear right paw, likely caused by an illegal hunter's trap. He noticed drag marks on the ground around it, signs that the animal had tried to free itself without success. "How did this happen to you, girl?" Jack murmured, his voice soft, almost inaudible. He knew that speaking in a calm tone might help keep the animal at ease. The jaguar responded only with a deep gaze. For a man who prided himself on knowing the forest like the back of his hand, Jack was at a loss for how to interpret it. A lump formed in his throat as he realized that this powerful predator, a symbol of strength in the jungle, was now at the mercy of his decision. Jack slowly opened his backpack and took out a canteen of water. Pouring some onto the lid, he carefully pushed it toward the jaguar. To his surprise, the animal sniffed the water before licking a few drops. It was a sign. Perhaps she wasn't ready to trust him completely, but she also seemed to know she had no other choice. With this small connection made, Jack began thinking about how he could help. He knew the wound wasn't superficial. Without treatment, infection would set in within days. But there was another problem. How could he get close enough to help without triggering the Jaguar's fear or survival instincts? He inched a bit closer, but as he reached out to examine the paw, the animal let out a warning sound, a rough growl that made Jack freeze. He immediately pulled back, understanding he needed to earn more trust. Then he had an idea. Jack pulled a small piece of dried meat from his backpack, something he carried as a snack during hunts. Placing the food on the ground near the Jaguar but just out of reach of her jaws, he waited to see if she would trust him enough to move and take the offering. The Jaguar watched him cautiously. For a moment, Jack thought she wouldn't move, but then, with visible effort, she slowly advanced, her paws dragging across the ground. When she finally reached the dried meat, she paused, looked directly at Jack, and, in a gesture that felt almost solemn, took the food. Without baring her teeth, Jack felt an inexplicable relief. Despite the fear, he realized there was an opening to help. "All right, girl, we're going to get you out of here," he said firmly. But how? Carrying a wounded predator was a task that defied every rule of safety he knew. On top of that, night was falling, and with it, the dangers of the forest would only increase. He needed to act quickly, but every choice came with enormous risks, for himself and for the Jaguar. Jack knelt, eyes fixed on the wounded Jaguar. The decision before him was agonizing: risk his own life to save a predator or leave it to the mercy of the forest, where its chances of survival were slim to none. As he deliberated, his mind drifted to the past. He recalled a distant afternoon decades ago when he was just a 12-year-old boy. His father, a renowned hunter, had taken Jack on his first expedition into the forest. They had come across a fawn trapped in a thorny bush. While Jack begged to help it, his father had been resolute. "It's not our place to interfere," he had said firmly, but Jack had never forgotten the sound of the fawn crying as they walked away. It was a sound that haunted him to this day, a reminder that he had once stood by and allowed something helpless to suffer. He had sworn then that he would never be a mere spectator to suffering again, even though his life as a hunter often cast him in the role of taking life. Back in the present, Jack stared at the Jaguar. This powerful creature was no helpless fawn. It was wild, dangerous, and capable of killing him if it chose to react. Yet in that moment, the line between hunter and prey seemed blurred. He wasn't facing a trophy. He was facing a life. Taking a deep breath, Jack made his decision. He knew it was a risky gamble, but he couldn't turn away. The Jaguar needed him, and something in his heart told him that helping her was the right thing to do. "All right, girl, I'm going to get you out of here, but we'll need to work together," he said, as if the animal could understand him. He began to improvise. Pulling one of the shirts from his backpack, he tore it into wide strips. His plan was to fashion a makeshift bandage to stop the bleeding and create a support to stabilize the injured paw. Every move had to be calculated to avoid scaring the animal. Jack approached cautiously, keeping his gaze locked on the Jaguar's golden eyes. He extended his hand slowly, showing her a strip of fabric before moving closer to the wound. The Jaguar let out a low growl, a guttural sound that sent a shiver down Jack's spine. "I know, this is going to hurt," he murmured, trying to stay calm. He understood that any sudden movement could be perceived as a threat. When Jack touched the paw for the first time, the Jaguar flinched but didn't attack. He saw that the cut was even worse than he had imagined, likely infected with dirt and insects. Working quickly, he tied the strips of fabric around the wound, creating an improvised tourniquet to stem the bleeding. As he worked, the silence of the forest seemed to press down on him. Every sound, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of a bird, felt amplified. Jack could feel sweat dripping down his forehead, but his resolve didn't waver. He had to finish before the Jaguar's patience ran out. Finally, with the bandage secured, Jack stepped back, assessing his work. It wasn't perfect, but it would give the Jaguar a fighting chance. Now came the most daunting part: getting her to safety. He looked at the animal and spoke softly. "Now we're getting out of here. I'm not leaving you behind." The question hammering in his mind was how he would transport a predator weighing nearly 200 pounds without putting himself in greater danger. A daring but dangerous idea began to take shape. With the night fast approaching, time was his greatest enemy. Jack was about to face the most challenging test of his life. Jack glanced at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to emerge. Night was falling, and he knew time was running out. He had to get the Jaguar out of there before other predators, or worse, illegal hunters, appeared in the darkness. But how could he move such a large and dangerous animal? That was the question. Rummaging through his backpack, Jack searched for anything that might help. Besides the improvised bandages, he had a few basic items: thin ropes, a knife, and a piece of tarp he used for shelter from the rain. Maybe this will work, he thought. His plan was simple in theory, but risky in practice. To improvise a stretcher using the tarp and ropes, tying it in a way that would allow him to drag the Jaguar without carrying her directly. But to do so, he needed to gain even more of the animal's trust. "Come on, girl, this is to help you," he said, moving slowly so as not to startle her. The Jaguar watched him intently, analyzing his every movement with her golden eyes. Even injured, she was still a predator, and Jack knew that any sudden behavior could be interpreted as a threat. He spread the tarp on the ground just a few inches from the animal. Then he looped the ropes to secure the edges and carefully adjusted everything around the Jaguar, ensuring it wouldn't press against her wound. Every second was a mix of tension and patience, with Jack speaking softly, as if trying to convince the Jaguar that she was safe. When everything was ready, Jack gave the tarp a gentle tug to test the weight. The animal let out a faint growl, but didn't resist. It was as if she had accepted that she needed help, or perhaps she was simply too weak to fight. "This will work," Jack murmured to himself, taking a deep breath before beginning the rescue for real. The journey through the forest was a grueling test of endurance. Jack pulled the makeshift stretcher with all his strength, but the weight of the Jaguar and the uneven terrain made every step a challenge. The tree roots seemed alive, tripping him up and hindering his progress. To make matters worse, the sounds of the forest at night were intensifying. The calls of nocturnal birds, distant monkey screeches, and the occasional roar of other predators echoed through the trees. Jack knew he was in dangerous territory, and any mistake could be fatal. The Jaguar, though visibly exhausted, remained alert. Jack noticed that despite her injury, she occasionally lifted her head as if scanning the surroundings. Her vigilance gave him an odd sense of security, as though she were repaying his efforts by keeping watch for external threats. After about an hour of arduous trekking, Jack reached a small stream he knew was near his cabin. This was where he planned to tend to the Jaguar more carefully and allow her to recover her strength. He paused for a moment, panting, and bent down to scoop up some fresh water from the stream. "Almost there, girl. Just a little further," he said, glancing at the Jaguar, who now seemed calmer. But before he could continue, a noise caught his attention. A sharp crack of a breaking branch coming from the darkness to his left. Jack froze. His years of experience as a hunter told him they weren't alone. With measured breaths, he reached for his rifle, but didn't raise it yet. The oppressive silence that followed felt like the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Jack glanced at the Jaguar, who was now growling softly, ears pinned forward, focused on the direction of the sound. "Whatever it is, we're not letting it stop us," Jack whispered, steeling himself for what might come next. He knew the next move would be critical, for both himself and the Jaguar. Jack felt every muscle in his body tense as he scanned the darkness. The sound of snapping branches from the dense forest to his left was no accident. He knew something, or someone, was watching them. The Jaguar, despite her injury, had risen slightly on the top. Her low, continuous growl signaled both alertness and a surprising readiness to defend herself. Jack crouched beside her, one hand gripping his rifle, the other on the rope tied to the makeshift stretcher. "Whoever you are, we're not backing down," he whispered, summoning his courage. Suddenly, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was even more unsettling. In the forest, the absence of sound often signaled an imminent attack. Jack turned his head slowly toward where the noise had originated, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. And then he saw it. From the shadows of the underbrush, a pair of glowing eyes reflected the faint starlight. It wasn't a human, it was another predator. Judging by its posture and stealthy movements, Jack recognized it instantly. A puma, likely drawn by the scent of the Jaguar's blood. The puma advanced cautiously, its body low and muscles coiled, assessing the scene. For a predator like this, a wounded animal was an irresistible opportunity. Jack knew he had to act quickly before the situation spiraled out of control. "Not today," Jack muttered to himself, raising his rifle. He had no intention of killing the puma. He wasn't here to start a fight, but he also wouldn't let the Jaguar be attacked. In one swift motion, he fired a shot into the air. The deafening crack of the rifle echoed through the forest like thunder, startling the puma, which immediately retreated into the shadows. Jack stayed vigilant, watching to see if the predator would return. But to his relief, the puma vanished among the trees. The Jaguar's growl subsided, and she lay back down on the tarp, still alert but seemingly relieved. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "We're okay, girl. Let's keep moving," he said in a low but steady voice. He pulled the tarp with renewed determination, aware that every wasted minute could attract more predators. The forest at night was unforgiving, and he needed to reach the safety of the cabin before anything worse happened. The rough terrain made the journey increasingly grueling. Jack's arms burned, his legs trembled, but he didn't stop. Every step forward felt like a small victory. The Jaguar, though injured, cooperated in an unexpected way. She didn't growl, didn't resist. It was as if she understood that Jack was doing everything he could to help her. Finally, the cabin came into view. Nestled in a clearing and surrounded by tall trees, it was a simple but secure refuge. Jack felt an immense wave of relief at the sight of the wooden walls he had built with his own hands years ago. "We made it, girl," he said, pulling the tarp up the final incline to the porch. Reaching the cabin, Jack opened the door and quickly prepared a spot on the floor, layering blankets to make a resting place for the Jaguar. He knew he needed to be cautious. The animal was still wild and could react unpredictably to any sudden movement. With great effort, Jack lifted the Jaguar onto the blankets, careful not to aggravate her wound. Once she was settled, he wiped the sweat from his brow and sank to the floor, exhausted. He looked at the Jaguar, who now seemed less tense, her head resting on her front paws. For a brief moment their eyes met, and in her gaze, Jack saw something that felt like gratitude. But he knew the work wasn't over. The next step was to properly clean the wound, treat it, and ensure it didn't become infected. For now, though, he needed a moment to catch his breath. And so did she. As the night enveloped the cabin, Jack listened to the familiar sounds of the forest outside. This time, however, he didn't feel alone. He had an unexpected companion, one who was challenging everything he thought he knew about the relationship between humans and animals. The only sounds were Jack's labored breathing and the occasional low grunt from the Jaguar. Though they had reached safety, Jack knew the hardest part was yet to come, treating the animal's wound. It would require courage, patience, and a bit of luck. He walked over to an old wooden cabinet where he kept a modest first aid kit. Jack was a hunter, but he also understood the demands of life in the forest. He had enough experience to deal with deep cuts, minor infections, and even broken bones. On himself, that is. But now he was facing a wild predator, and that added an entirely new layer of complexity. As he searched for gauze, disinfectant, and scissors, a soft sound behind him caught his attention. Turning slowly, he saw the Jaguar trying to stand. Her front paws trembled under the effort, but she collapsed back down with a heavy sigh. "Easy, girl. I know it hurts, but we've got to take care of this," Jack said, gathering his supplies and kneeling by her side. The wound on her back leg was worse than he had feared. The tissue around it was inflamed, and early signs of infection were apparent. The cut, likely caused by a steel trap, was deep and jagged, with bits of dirt embedded in the flesh. Jack knew cleaning it would be agonizing for the animal, and that was what worried him most. Before starting, he looked into her eyes, trying to gauge her mood. She was exhausted, but her eyes still held a sharp awareness. Jack knew he had to work quickly and carefully to avoid triggering her instincts and putting them both in danger. "This is going to hurt, but I promise it'll help," he murmured, hoping to calm her. He began by pouring warm water from a kettle over the wound, gently washing away the surface dirt. The Jaguar growled low, her muscles tensing, but she didn't try to move. Jack took this as a sign of trust, or perhaps resignation. The hardest part came next, disinfecting the wound. Jack soaked a piece of gauze in the antiseptic and pressed it gently against the cut. The Jaguar's roar was so intense, it made the entire cabin tremble. Jack immediately pulled back, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. I know. Just a little more, okay?" He gave her a moment to settle before continuing. Moving with deliberate care, Jack cleaned the cut, removing embedded debris and replacing his makeshift bandages with something cleaner and more secure. The Jaguar's breathing was heavy, her eyes blinking slowly as though fighting the pain and exhaustion. When he finally finished, Jack wrapped her injured leg in fresh gauze and secured it carefully. "There, now you just need to rest," he said, backing away to give her space. The Jaguar watched him for a moment before fully lying down, resting her head on her front paws. For the first time, Jack noticed a hint of relaxation in her posture, however faint. He leaned against the wooden wall of the cabin, the exhaustion finally catching up to him. As he gazed at the now sleeping animal, a faint smile crossed his face. The situation felt surreal. Here he was, a hunter who had always approached nature with caution and distrust, now caring for one of the forest's most feared creatures. In that moment, Jack realized this was about more than saving the Jaguar. It was about proving that even in the wild, where survival of the fittest ruled, compassion could carve out a place. As moonlight streamed through the cracks in the cabin's walls, Jack whispered to himself, "Maybe I'm learning more from her than she is from me." A soft glow bathed the interior as the forest awakened outside. Birds sang, and the gentle rustling of wind through the trees filled the air. Jack stirred awake, his body aching from the exhaustion of the day before. His eyes immediately went to the Jaguar. She was still lying in the corner where he had left her, her head resting on her front paws. Her eyes were open but unfocused, as if caught in an internal struggle between the pain of her wound and the unfamiliarity of being confined in a cabin with a human. Jack moved carefully toward her, each step measured to avoid startling the animal. He crouched beside her, inspecting the bandage on her injured back leg. The gauze was still in place, but patches of blood had seeped through. He would need to change it later, but for now, the priority was to ensure she stayed hydrated and nourished. He grabbed his canteen and poured fresh water into a metal bowl. The Jaguar lifted her head, her golden eyes watching him with cautious curiosity. Jack pushed the bowl toward her slowly. She hesitated, sniffing the air, then finally drank in small, measured sips. "Good girl," he said softly, his tone low and reassuring, almost as if he was speaking to a domestic pet. Next, Jack pulled a piece of dried meat from his bag, cutting it into smaller strips. He knew the Jaguar needed energy to begin healing. He placed the pieces on the floor at a safe distance and waited. The Jaguar looked at the meat, then at Jack. After a moment's hesitation, she stretched her neck toward the food, grabbing a piece with visible effort. The sound of her teeth tearing into the meat broke the cabin's silence. Jack watched intently, struck by the juxtaposition of her raw strength and her current vulnerability. Jack carefully cleaned her, wound, replacing the bandages regularly, even when it elicited low warning growls from the Jaguar. He understood the process was painful for her, but each change revealed signs of improvement. The inflammation subsided, and the bleeding nearly stopped. During this time, Jack noticed subtle changes in the Jaguar's behavior. At first, her golden eyes followed his every move, ever watchful and ready to react. But as the days went by, her vigilance softened. One moment surprised him. She allowed him to approach without growling. Jack knelt beside her, examining her paw without needing to speak in hushed tones to calm her. He realized he was earning her trust, something he had never imagined possible. As her strength returned, the Jaguar began to exhibit behaviors more typical of her wild nature. Jack watched as she tried to stand and move around the cabin. Her first attempts were clumsy. She limped and avoided putting weight on her injured leg. But she persisted, stubborn and determined, taking more steps each day. Jack couldn't help but smile as he watched her. "You're a fighter, you know that?" he said, almost to himself. As Jack cared for the Jaguar, he found his own perspective shifting. He had always seen the forest as a battleground where survival of the fittest ruled, with humans and animals on opposing sides. But now, tending to this Jaguar, he began to see nature differently. Maybe it wasn't always about who was strongest. Perhaps, in moments like this, what truly mattered was the capacity to help and be helped. One quiet afternoon, while Jack rested against the cabin wall, the Jaguar did something he never expected. She approached him slowly, still limping, and lay down just a few inches away. Jack froze, barely daring to breathe. It was a small gesture, but to him, it was a profound acknowledgement that she recognized she wasn't alone. "We're in this together, girl," he whispered, his voice tinged with emotion. The bond between them grew stronger as the Jaguar recovered, physically and emotionally. Jack could see her returning to her natural self, her strength and instincts sharpening with each passing day. But he also knew the time was approaching for another hard choice, letting her go. He would need to return her to the wild, where she belonged. And though the thought of saying goodbye pained him, Jack understood it was the only way for her to truly heal. The days in the cabin had settled into an almost harmonious routine. The Jaguar, now stronger, could walk around the small space with only a slight limp. While she remained alert, she seemed more at ease around Jack, who continued caring for her with patience and devotion. It was a cool morning, with a soft mist blanketing the forest around the cabin. Jack was preparing a simple breakfast, bread and dried meat, while the Jaguar rested near the door, her gaze fixed on the forest beyond. He noticed her eyes gleaming again, full of life, but there was also something else. A yearning, a desire to return to the wild. Jack sighed. He knew their time together was drawing to a close. "Soon, girl, soon you'll be ready to go home," he said, as much to reassure himself as her. The tranquility was broken by the loud sound of leaves crunching and branches snapping nearby. Jack stood immediately, his hunter's instincts kicking in. He grabbed his rifle and cautiously opened the door. Outside, the sight made his blood run cold. A small group of poachers was advancing through the clearing, armed with rifles and carrying equipment typical of those hunting valuable prey. Jack recognized them from local rumors. They were notorious for their brutality. He knew that if they found the Jaguar, they wouldn't hesitate to kill her for her fur or other parts to sell on the black market. Jack closed the door slowly, trying not to make a sound, and turned to the Jaguar. She was tense, the fur along her back bristling. Her golden eyes met his, and for a moment it felt as though there was a silent understanding between them. "I won't let them hurt you," Jack whispered, grabbing a knife and placing the rifle near the door for easy access. The poachers drew closer, their voices carrying through the stillness. "Did you see those tracks? Must be a big cat around here," one of them said. Jack realized they were following the trail he and the Jaguar had left during the rescue. He needed to act quickly. The cabin was simple, with no defenses, and he was outnumbered. Looking back at the Jaguar, an audacious idea formed in his mind. He opened the door carefully, signaling for her to follow him. The Jaguar hesitated, her instincts holding her back, but when Jack gestured again, she rose and limped after him. Together, they moved silently into the dense forest behind the cabin, hiding in a cluster of rocks and thick bushes as the poachers reached the clearing. From their hiding spot, Jack watched the men circling the cabin. They seemed suspicious, inspecting the tracks around the area. One of them kicked the door open and stepped inside. Jack held his breath, hoping they wouldn't realize how close he was. Then, something unexpected happened. As the poachers neared their hiding spot, the Jaguar rose to her full height and let out a roar so deep and powerful that it seemed to silence the entire forest. The men froze. They turned toward the sound, their faces pale as the massive feline emerged from the shadows. Even Jack, who had come to know the Jaguar's strength, was awestruck. She was a queen of the jungle, standing tall and fearless despite her injury. The poachers, visibly shaken, began to back away. One fired a shot into the air, but it only reinforced the Jaguar's dominance. She took a step toward them, teeth bared and growling. That was all it took. They bolted, disappearing into the forest in the opposite direction. Jack exhaled deeply, only now realizing he'd been holding his breath. He looked at the Jaguar who stood beside him, breathing heavily, but exuding a sense of triumph. "You saved us," he said, his voice tinged with awe. In that moment, Jack felt the depth of their connection. The Jaguar wasn't just a wounded wild animal anymore. She was his partner in survival, a force of nature that had chosen to trust him. As they slowly made their way back to the cabin, Jack knew he would never forget what had just happened. The Jaguar had proven that even in her fragility, she was a powerful being, capable of commanding respect and fear. Most importantly, she had chosen to stand by him. The clearing around the cabin was quiet again. The poachers were gone, and the forest seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Jack and the Jaguar were back in the cabin, both exhausted but alive. Yet Jack knew these were among the last moments they would share together. As he watched the Jaguar resting in the corner of the cabin, Jack felt a tightness in his chest. He had spent weeks caring for her, witnessing her recovery and forming an unlikely bond. But as much as he wished to stay by her side, he knew this wasn't where she belonged. The forest was the true home of such a majestic predator. That afternoon, Jack began preparing for the moment he had been putting off. He gathered his tools, dismantled the makeshift stretcher he had used during the rescue, and packed some fresh meat to give her the strength she would need to return to the wild. Every task felt heavier than the last. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Jack finally approached the Jaguar. She was lying down but raised her head as he knelt beside her. Jack extended his hand slowly, something he would have never dared to do before. To his surprise, the Jaguar didn't pull away. Her golden eyes met his, and Jack felt that she understood what was about to happen. "It's time for you to go, girl," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. Carefully, Jack opened the cabin door and stepped aside, leaving the path clear. The Jaguar hesitated, rising with effort. Though she had recovered, there was still a faint limp in her back leg. She walked slowly to the doorway, pausing at the threshold to look back at Jack one last time. The silence between them was more profound than any words. To Jack, her gaze was a mix of gratitude and farewell. He tried to smile but couldn't hold back the wave of emotion. "You'll be fine. This forest is your home," he murmured, his throat tight. The Jaguar took her final step outside. Under the fiery orange sky of dusk, her silhouette looked more imposing than ever. Jack watched as she moved toward the forest, her lithe body gradually disappearing among the trees. Just before vanishing completely, the Jaguar stopped. She turned her head, looking back at Jack one last time. He didn't know what it meant. Perhaps it was a final thank you, or maybe just the instinct of a predator. But to Jack, that moment was everything. And then, she was gone. Jack stood in the doorway for several minutes, his heart heavy yet filled with a profound sense of fulfillment. He had saved a life, but in many ways he felt it was the Jaguar who had saved him. Back inside the cabin, Jack looked up at the sky, now speckled with stars, and reflected on what he had just experienced. He, a hunter, had learned more about compassion and courage in those brief weeks than in his entire life. The forest, which he once viewed as a battlefield, now felt like a place of connection and learning. As he closed the cabin door, he whispered, "Good luck, girl. I hope we meet again someday." Even if their paths never crossed again, Jack knew that their encounter had changed them both forever. Weeks passed, and life in the forest seemed to return to normal. Jack continued to explore the surrounding wilderness, but something had changed. The man who once saw animals merely as prey now observed them with respect and admiration. Every paw print in the dirt, every rustle in the underbrush, brought memories of the Jaguar and the bond they had shared. One afternoon, while walking along the trail near the stream, Jack came across something that made him stop. On the muddy bank were large paw prints, unmistakably familiar. He crouched down to touch them, his heart racing. "You're nearby, girl," he murmured, a faint smile forming on his lips. Even without seeing her, Jack felt their connection linger. Perhaps she was out there, living her life as she should, hunting, roaming freely through the forest. Or perhaps, he thought with a mix of hope and wonder, she was watching him from afar, ensuring he was safe, just as he had done for her. Back at the cabin, Jack opened an old notebook he had kept for years but rarely used. Though he wasn't much of a writer, he felt compelled to record the experience. He wrote about the rescue, the Jaguar's fight to survive, and the way she had taught him something he'd never learned in all his years as a hunter. That true strength isn't about dominating nature, but respecting and protecting it. One night, as he gazed at the stars through the cabin's window, Jack reflected on how their encounter had transformed him. He had always considered himself a solitary man, a hunter living for the thrill of the chase and the satisfaction of overcoming challenges. But now he saw the forest not as a battleground, but as a shared home, full of beings who, like him, struggled to survive each day. Jack decided his days as a hunter were coming to an end. Instead, he began dedicating himself to protecting the forest he had grown to love. He sought out ways to combat illegal poaching and even considered turning his cabin into a wildlife observation post to help preserve the animals. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could shape his future. The Jaguar had shown him that, not through words, but through her strength, resilience, and above all, her trust. On the last page of his notebook, Jack wrote a reflection that captured everything he felt. Sometimes, life tests us in unexpected ways, but it's in those moments that we find our true strength. I thought I was helping a jaguar survive, but in truth, she was teaching me how to live. With those words, Jack closed the notebook, extinguished the light, and went to bed, feeling more at peace than ever before. Outside, in the darkness of the forest, a pair of golden eyes gleamed for a moment before vanishing into the trees. If this story moved you, if these events and reflections added something new to your journey, don't forget to share this video. Give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and help us share these stories and thoughts with even more people.